So let's talk about the slightly thorny topic of list tailoring in Warhammer 40k. What is it? How much of a problem is it? And do people generally consider it a form of cheating or an acceptable practice? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about Warhammer 40k etiquette in casual games. And in this video I wanted to talk about the topic of list tailoring, basically trying to pick your army based on what your opponent has taken to gain an advantage. In general in Warhammer 40k, at least in a vacuum, if you're building army lists, I'd say that building a take all comers list tends to perhaps be the default, making just the generically strongest army that you can make out of your faction right now, something that's going to be able to handle whatever's thrown at it, whether it's forces that are common in your local area or not, and not just having one opponent or small subsets of opponents in mind when you're taking your unit choices. I generally prefer to try and build lists that way, without being too high-minded as to what might counter certain things in a local meta, and maybe just have an army that I could happily take to a tournament if I wanted, if you're playing a sort of semi-competitive, casual match play game. List tailoring, though, I generally define as if you don't really do that, basically having some sort of forewarning as to what army or what type of army your opponent is going to play, maybe just a general sense of their list or knowledge of their models in their collection, and then specifically changing your army to try and play them and beat that specific army, whether it's by a few small subconscious picks that are perhaps tweaks from what you might normally have because you know they do well in that matchup, all the way to full-blown hard counter-type armies. I'll go through some examples in a second. In previous videos I've often talked about it in similar sort of videos, talking about 40k etiquette, ways that you could potentially annoy an opponent, and maybe being kind of on the borderline with outright cheating. Though I remember when I did talk about it in those ones, it triggered a little bit of debate in the comments. Perhaps compared with other things in the videos, people weren't so sure that list tailoring is always cheating, and in some situations it might be kind of acceptable. I feel like it's definitely one where context is important though. I feel like there's certainly a big difference between bringing a force that's kind of probably effective into your opponent's army and making sure that there at least is a close game, as opposed to out and out running something that's an outright hard counter. Those feel like very different things indeed. And even for some players playing in a lore and narrative type perspective, it just kind of makes intuitive sense that if you've got your army deploying to the field, they would naturally want to take weapons that can counter the enemy that they're going to be fighting. You could reasonably imagine a force of Space Marines taking a whole bunch of anti-tank firepower if they know there's going to be loads of enemy knights and armor in the field, for example. Just to get a rough temperature check of how people feel about it, I did a YouTube poll a little while back, basically asking if list tailoring had ever caused problems in casual games to you, either for you or your opponents, and kind of as I suspected, I'd read this as basically saying that it does happen from time to time, though it isn't exactly a common problem. Out of the people who were responding to the main question, a bit over half said that it had caused problems at least once, but only a small percentage of people saying that it actually regularly caused issues in their games, as opposed to presumably thinking back to one major time when it had happened. For a couple of examples of what it might look like in practice, maybe here's just one situation that you might credibly run into. Maybe one Euro player has a limited model collection, perhaps is playing Space Marines and has a lot of 2-wound Space Marine models running around the table, things that they've acquired from combat patrols perhaps, and because they're a newer player to the game, they don't really have a lot of scope for adjusting lists game to game. The models that they're playing with might be the only ones that they have. It does mean that if they arrange a game with another player, that other player is probably going to know exactly what units they're going to bring, and they could potentially get a fairly big advantage by taking things that kill Space Marines easily. Maybe a lot of things like plasma weapons or heavy bolters, things that can handle the standard Space Marine profile kind of well. It might be done kind of deliberately, which would be a bit unpleasant, though I could certainly see how it could be done subconsciously as well. You're just used to those units being some of the best and most exciting ones that you can play with, and if you do play this new player regularly, you're probably going to see those profiles as some of your better ones, and you might take more of them as a result. It could be even more extreme if you're facing a more proper skew list, say a player running knights so the opponent takes nothing but anti-tank weapons when they turn up to a game, safe in the knowledge they don't really need any small arms and things as there won't be any little guys on the table. So not really building a list that's very take all comers, and they'd run into problems if they did face a horde style list, and if they were taking an army to a tournament, they might think about that and take something a bit more balanced. If you take just the right offensive weapons to destroy the opponent's army perfectly, then it might well be a short and brutal game. Maybe another slightly lower level bad example could be if two players are meeting for a game and one player shares their list early. I feel like that kind of often happens if you've organised a game night and someone's getting their army together during the day. The second player, who's maybe a bit slower getting their army together and hasn't written their army list yet, might just wind up taking a few special weapon profiles or things that could help deal with a particularly threatening unit they might not have expected to see otherwise. Maybe doing this completely consciously, which seems a bit harsh to the first player who's trusted you not to change your army list, though I feel like it certainly could be done subconsciously as well. Seeing the army list perhaps nudging you towards certain choices, even if you're not outright thinking it and planning it out. I've certainly seen some players who tend to keep lists under wraps until they actually turn up, just to remove that as any sort of factor, whether it's conscious or subconscious. Those two I'd say are at least fairly bad examples, and I would generally say that that's probably kind of cheating to basically use prior knowledge of the enemy's army just to give your force a major or minor leg up in terms of the weapon profiles that you're taking. Certainly doesn't really seem too fair to the person whose army contents that you know. On the other hand, though, I do feel like it's considered a bit more acceptable if the power balance is going the other way. I feel like if you frame things a bit differently and there was an imbalance in skill that one player was struggling to overcome, people might be a bit more sympathetic to a small amount of list tailoring. Maybe say, for example, if two players are regular opponents and one player's just been repeatedly beaten by an opponent's horde list, a skew list with a whole ton of infantry, perhaps playing green tide orcs or unending swarm tyranids or similar. I have a feeling that if the power balance is going all one way, I don't think many people would really begrudge their opponent taking a little bit more anti-infantry firepower, even if that is kind of similar sort of list tailoring, gaining an advantage that way. Maybe the difference being that the first player is using a more skewed army list that isn't really very balanced and is using it to win a whole load. I feel like just in general, if the overall outcome is to have a more balanced game between two players, then that seems like the best outcome if you're playing casually. Who knows, maybe the skilled competitive player with the Horde army list might actually appreciate a bit more of a challenge so they can practice with their army against a bad matchup perhaps. Besides just choosing weapon profiles and things, there are quite a lot of other ways that people could list tailor in Warhammer 40k. One that I've certainly heard about a bit is maybe having multiple set army lists that someone might like to run. Say someone in a game store doing a casual pickup game might have a few different rosters available to them, and depending on exactly what they're fighting, they might take one thing or another. Perhaps one list that's anti-Necrons and one list that's anti-Space Marines, for example. You kind of could do similar to some extent with the choice of faction that you're playing. Some can counter each other's pretty hard at top levels. Maybe one example is Thousand Sons versus Necrons, perhaps. They tend to have the sheer damage they need to overcome individual hyper-resilient Necron units, and the Thousand Sons tend to win the majority of games in that matchup, even if they're both powerful armies. There's choice of weapon profiles, as we mentioned, but maybe choice of defensive profiles as well, perhaps just bringing an excessive amount of tanks or vehicles if you know that your opponent is very light on their anti-tank units that they have access to. And finally, I guess more specific situational tools as well. Maybe having good precision in an army where you know it's going to be strong against a list with lots of support characters, or anti-psycho options if you're playing a psycho-heavy army, maybe Grey Knights or Thousand Sons. There certainly are a few units in Warhammer 40k that could just be extra good in one niche matchup, even if they're kind of bad in others. I'd say in general that using most of those in perhaps one of the above situations, where things are kind of even, maybe having a pickup game at a local store, messaging lists before a game, or just know the contents of the other player's collection, perhaps seems generally like a bit of poor etiquette there. And certainly if it's done to extremes, seems like it could really impact the fun factor of a game. Having your army table turned to because you've just run into a hard counter that your opponent has orchestrated for you isn't really the most fun thing in the world. For other situations, I guess you could have the option of both players being able to do a bit of list tailoring to some extent or another, maybe for an opponent that you know particularly well, and both of you have some pretty big model collections. I feel like if you've both got armies that have got plenty of options and neither of them significantly hard counter each other, it could actually be a kind of interesting little mini game in itself, maybe trying to guess what the other person might turn up with out of all the options they have and take a few of yours along. No doubt to be slightly surprised maybe by an alternative build that they've come up with in the meantime. Seems like that could be kind of fun, keeping all units blind until you turn up to the game, and then see if you've managed to outwit the opponent at the list building stage before you get into the actual in-game tactics. I know for this want to focus a lot on people trying to gain rules advantages over one another in the army list building, though I feel like in reality, and as referenced by that poll earlier, it's not exactly a widespread issue. I feel like you're probably more likely to actually find people do the opposite. and maybe occasionally do the opposite of list tailoring, trying to make sure the army is sufficiently de-optimized to allow it to go toe-to-toe with a more casual one a bit more fairly. This one perhaps just part of the normal pre-game discussion that you normally need to have before 40k. What sort of game do you want to play? Are we testing out some cutthroat tournament cheese, or are we going for a more casual laid-back game with a big mix of units? I think it's also fairly common for people to warn people about skew lists and things if they're wanting to run one. Maybe saying that you're going to build a vehicle-heavy army, so maybe make sure that you have a bit of anti-tank to make sure that you can cope with some. It's probably best to give people a heads up like that and make sure that you're not at too much of a massive rules advantage, at least if the aim is to have a fun and close game and you don't turn up to the battle to find out that you've basically beaten your opponent already at the list building stage. For all of this, I really am more focusing on more casual games, even if they're casual match play ones with things that you might try and take to tournaments later. I guess list tailoring is kind of adjacent to the whole idea of building your army for the meta it's going to be playing in, whatever that might be. At the top tables of grand tournaments, people know the most common effective builds for a whole bunch of 40k armies, so might certainly design armies with a certain enemy in mind, plus taking things that are going to be effective on the right terrain and missions. At a more local scene, people certainly could build and tailor to a more local meta, kind of knowing a little bit about what you might encounter, but just maybe having one stock list to play against your own friend group of maybe 5 or 6 friends or something like that. I guess to some extent you can still build to the armies that you expect to be fighting, but I feel like again that would probably be considered a bit more acceptable given that you can't really skew too heavily towards any one player's army list for risk of being somewhat weak against other things. Obviously, the army list to beat in Warhammer 40k change absolutely all the time with Games Workshop's rules updates. In terms of building to any sort of meta though, for the most part in 40k's history, Space Marines tend to be at least fairly prevalent, given how many factions there are in power armor. Most armies need to know that they can have a fighting chance against Space Marines, so having things that can handle things with 2 or 3 wound infantry with good saves don't tend to be the worst idea in the world. Though currently I feel like the actual top tier competitive meta is a bit less obvious than normal. There's a whole load of variety of army lists that are doing well right now. Perhaps one of the single most overrepresented might be the Orc Bully Boys currently. Maybe a good example of a powerful list that's say somewhat of a stat check type list as well. Maybe best to have some sort of plan as to how you'd handle a whole bunch of mega knobs if you're going for grand tournament sort of placings. It might be more or less relevant at a local sort of scene though. Overall, for list tailoring at a more casual level, though, my general take would be normally probably don't do it. I think if both armies are going to have a relatively even game anyway, it's not really worth trying to get a kind of unfair leg up on the opponent via reactionary choice of certain things, particularly if the opponent doesn't have an equal chance to do the same to you. Having said that, though, it's probably just best to keep the focus on getting a close game at a more casual level. And there might be a fair bit more acceptance of it if you're clearly trying to punch up against an opponent running some sort of skew list, or if the opponent wants to try out some sort of weird list where it's a lot of one profile that you're not going to have too much chance against otherwise. It might not be the worst thing ever. Probably the most important thing is just to have a good conversation between the two people playing though. Otherwise, if you are actually trying to get better with an army and play a few more casual competitive type games to try and improve, then list tailoring to any one opponent's list is certainly not really going to help you with that, just giving you an easier ride than you might get at, say, a grand tournament or something like that. If there's any tailoring, then it's best to do it to the overall meta or the meta of the event that you're going to be playing in. And for any practice games, if anything, it might be worth practicing bad matchups as opposed to the ones that you think that you'll win easily. In any case, though, I think I'll leave that there for a talk about list tailoring. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Have there been any particularly bad times where you've had an opponent tailor things against you, or you've done the tailoring yourself accidentally or on purpose? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.